So I hope you took a few minutes at least to check out what the text is tonight. We're not covering many verses, but we're basically going to cover the subject of money. Some of you say, I wouldn't have come if you'd have just told me. I did. I sent out notes that you could see what tonight was about. When I was in full-time ministry, I didn't like to preach about money. Several reasons for that. One was I had more important issues to deal with. Secondly, I knew that for the most part, the congregation didn't want to hear about it. They didn't like the subject of money. And I could tell that whenever I preached about it. I could see it all over their faces. So I did it grudgingly. Probably the main reason I didn't like to do it was that I got the impression that the people in the congregation thought that the only reason I was preaching about money is so that I could have more money. Like it had anything to do with me at all, which it did not. But they seemed to think that it did, and therefore, it was just not a subject that I enjoyed very much. However, here is a truth that I didn't realize until, a number of years ago now. At my age, it has been a few years. That besides the subject of the kingdom of God, Jesus talked more about money than he did any other subject. So, if you think, well, the preacher, he just preaches about money way too much, you would have hated Jesus preaching. I'm telling you. He talks about it a lot. Next to the kingdom of God, it is the topic that he spent most of the time preaching about. And I don't have to ask why. Why would he do that? Because he explains why he did that in these verses that we find in the Sermon on the Mount. Let's look at just the first, 2 or 3. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Most of us, when we buy new things, we would like them to last long enough where we think that, we got a good deal on them. But more and more we find out that we're disappointed in that because stuff just doesn't seem to last the way that we would want them to last. That's why God never intended that material things should define who we are. Whether it's the house we live in, or the car we drive, or the clothes we wear, those are not to define who we are or what our worth is. Our worth is determined by our relationship to God. Neither did God mean for our joy to come from material things. Our joy is to be the joy that comes from having Jesus Christ as Lord and reigning in our hearts and lives. That's supposed to be the source of the joy for our lives. Now, try to envision what the Sermon on the Mount looked like. Remember now, Jesus was seated. He sat down, which we haven't tried yet, but anyway, we're thinking about it. Jesus was seated and the crowd was standing. I don't know how many there were. When you see pictures, it looks like there were 10,000. I doubt there was 1,000. I'm just telling you, it's a hillside. But there's a lot of people there. It's called a crowd. Try to imagine what that crowd looks like. Most of them are peasants. You understand that? Most of them are peasants. They would in all likelihood have 1 or possibly 2 changes of clothing at the house. When Jesus taught this prayer, "Give us this day our daily bread," they took that seriously. because there were days when they didn't have daily bread and needed somehow God to supply it. So in our culture, when we've got, I think I've got 28 polo shirts. That's kind of a confession, but it's just more of a statement. When you think about the way the people in the first century would define rich, what would they think about our standard of living? They would be amazed. Maybe some would be even a little bit appalled. I don't know. But you don't have to be rich to serve money. Jesus didn't say these words, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. He didn't save them just for people in our generation. He spoke them to a crowd that had almost little. Almost little? Barely little. Maybe that's what I'm trying to say. Anyway, so he talks about things that can happen to earthly possessions. Moths. Anybody ever, have you seen a moth lately? I remember my mother upstairs had a cedar chest about yay by yay, and you put seasonal stuff in there and the mothballs. It only took about 3 or 4 weeks for the moth smell to wear off those garments when you pulled them out of that bin. Wow, did they stink to high heaven. Well, we have basically gotten rid of the moth issue, okay? Now, clothes aren't eaten by moths. They go out of style. They get to where they're too small. Why is everybody looking at me? And most of our clothes don't end up eaten. They end up in maybe some church room that is for poor people to come and get something that we no longer had use for, or maybe at the Salvation Army, or maybe somewhere else. But clothes come and go. Jesus says, don't put stock in things like clothes because they don't last. And then he says moth and rust. Now, in the New International Versions, like Paula's, it says vermin. Yeah. Just ignore that. That's a bit of a stretch anyway, and I don't want to spend 3 minutes talking about vermin when I can spend 5 minutes talking about rust, or something like rust. Back in February, Paula and I bought a nearly new Subaru Outback. It's a beautiful dark blue color. I get compliments when I take people to the airport about how nice it looks and how nice it rides, and it gets good mileage, and we just love our car. On the way back from Austin, there were 2 places where behind a fence that was only about 6 feet high, you could see flattened cars stacked 6 and 7 deep. And even with Subaru's reputation, I know that one of these days our beautiful new Subaru is going to be in a stack somewhere in a junkyard. Why? Because that's what happens to cars. So we can enjoy our car, but we have to realize it doesn't have permanence. Jesus says, don't waste all of your money on stuff that has no permanence, whether it's clothing, whether it's material things that can rust, or stuff that vermin can get, whatever that is. I'm not sure why they decided to translate that vermin, but anyway. I put a couple of scriptures in your notes. I don't know if any of you read them. They're from the Old Testament. Do you remember a fellow named Achan? He was just aching to get into trouble. Do you remember Achan? When the Israelites conquered the land, the first place they went to was Jericho. Anybody remember that? When they marched around the city and the walls fell? Well, there were instructions that went before the taking of Jericho. And these were the instructions. Everything in the city that has value belongs to God. It's all, quote, under the ban, is the way they said it. Nothing is for the people. Now you say, well, how does God use that stuff? You know, he gives it to the preachers. But anyway, that's kind of true. It would be used by the priests and the Levites and so forth. But anyway, don't touch anything. It's not for you. Well, Achan, when he was walking through the city, got into this house and he saw some stuff that, oh gosh, one of the things he saw was this ornate robe. And he said, I would look so good in that robe. I've got to have it. And he took it. And he paid a horrific price for it. But why would anybody jeopardize themselves and their families over something as measly as a robe? In those days, a robe was not measly. You would never, hardly ever have a chance to find a robe like that to wear. And Achan simply couldn't resist, and he took it and got himself into trouble. Now, has anybody here ever had their house broken into? Two, three, four. Oh, Lord. It's never happened to us. And I understand that it's a feeling that is unlike nearly anything else, where you just kind of feel violated that somebody was in your home and took your stuff. Well, Jesus says that anything that we own can be subject to theft. If you put your stock in this stuff, it can rust, and the moths can get it, or thieves can break in and steal it. Keep in mind the temporary nature, Jesus says, of all of your stuff. The time is coming when your stuff will be of no value. Not because of the stock market or anything like that, but because the time is coming when we will no longer have life. We will no longer be able to use our stuff. Now, how many of you have been to Egypt? Anybody been to Egypt? Debbie, you didn't ask me to go. What? Most of the pyramids that were built as tombs for the pharaohs. And in those pyramids, they put all kinds of riches and jewelry and gold. And do you know why? So that the pharaoh would have something to spend in the afterlife. Two things happened to all that stuff. One, grave robbers got it. Or number two, it ended up in a museum somewhere so that people could go by and say, look what the pharaohs used to have. They didn't get to spend it. It sounded like a good plan. It fit with their theology. It just doesn't fit with biblical theology. Jesus is telling us that it doesn't matter how much we have when we die, it's all gone. It has no value after that. That's why, as someone says, you never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul. Because stuff does not transfer from one life to the next. I don't know if this is a true story, but it's good enough it could be true. Two people had a funeral of a very wealthy individual. And one of them leaned over and said, I wonder how much he left. And the other one said, he left it all. I've told you that my two little granddaughters, 6 and 7, have become obsessed with our immortality. And one of the benefits of that is that it makes us aware of our mortality. If they're afraid of us dying, maybe we should be aware that that's happening as well. And Jesus says, hey, you need to be aware of that, or you are not going to have the kind of life that is fit for the kingdom. Remember, Jesus is describing kingdom life. He has come to create a kingdom. He is the king of that kingdom. And to be citizens of that kingdom, these are some of the things that he expects of us. And we have to take them seriously. Now, let me see where I am. Jesus says, you can't take it with you, but you can send it ahead. How How do we do that? How do you lay up treasures in heaven? We know how to buy stuff in the stock market or put it in the bank, but how do we lay up treasure in heaven? Well, I have a couple of ideas. Y'all probably have better ones, and feel free to share them with me if you do. I think mainly it is by prioritizing things that grow and enhance the kingdom. Remember now, this whole episode, this whole sermon has to do with kingdom life. And if Jesus wants us to lay up treasures in heaven, I think he wants us to spend our stuff, our money, whatever we might have, our resources, on things that will grow and enhance the kingdom. Even in the model prayer, he taught us to pray, your kingdom come, remember? And that means that, well, it means a lot of things. We talked about that in that lesson. But our resources can be used for enhancing and growing the kingdom, and I think that is at least part of what it means to lay up treasures in heaven. Let me tell you another one that you may or may not have thought of. By developing the kind of character that Jesus talks about in the Beatitudes, we lay up treasures in heaven. Remember we talked about how important it was for us to be meek, poor in spirit, pure in heart, merciful, that we would be people that hunger and thirst for righteousness, all of those things that are talked about in the Beatitudes. When we devote ourselves to trying to be that kind of people, we are laying up for ourselves treasures in heaven, because those things don't get valued on earth. You don't hear parents saying, I sure hope my boy grows up to be meek. It's not valued. Jesus says it is in heaven. And when we try to develop those characteristics, we are laying up treasures in heaven. And even persecution can be considered valuable if it builds Christian character. That's why Jesus says, blessed are you when you are persecuted, if it builds that kind of character that is more fit for the kingdom. Notice the key in verse 21. For where your treasure is, your heart will be also. Now we might think, okay, wherever we put our heart, that's where we put our treasure. Well, that may be true, but Jesus says, if you will put your treasure in the right place, your heart will follow your treasure. And isn't it interesting that eventually Jesus gets back to the condition of our hearts, which is always what God was concerned with. He wants our hearts to be focused on treasures that are not here, but they are there because that's the more important place to be. Now, I have told you about this before, and I honestly feel uncomfortable. I do feel uncomfortable talking to you about this, but Paula and I, when we travel, we try to find little things to do that are special for people that look like they need special. You remember? And please, I don't in any way, shape, or form consider myself to be an example. She is, but you know me, I'm not. But I don't know if I told you this example. It was when we were on our way home from our long road trip this summer. We stopped in some place, and we were in a motel, and the breakfast room was just bustling with people. And there was one attendant. Do you remember Paula? She was a Hispanic lady. She looked like she was too old to be doing the job that she was doing, you know, but looked like maybe that's what she had to do. So when we were back in the room, I told Paula, I'm going to go back and give her some money. And she wasn't in that room, so I had to go back kind of into the kitchen. And I said, excuse me, and I know what she thought. Oh no, another complaint. And I said, no, I'm fine. Come here. Her English wasn't very good. And I pulled out the money and I gave it to her. And her eyes got about as big as saucers. And she grabbed me and hugged me. Now you know why this is a good thing to do. She grabbed me and she hugged me. And I, in all truthfulness and sincerity, said, no, I'm not a generous person. Jesus is, and he's trying to help me be more generous. And she backed up and went, and tears just streamed from her eyes. Now, that's the kind of thing that is not only laying up treasures in heaven, it's the kind of thing that you will find real joy in doing. You know? And you just have to look for those opportunities to see those people. You know this woman was overworked and underpaid. And this just seemed to make her day. And not only was she grateful to me, but when I told her it was from Jesus, she gave him the glory. And that's really what we were looking for. Now, again, I'm not telling you this because I'm good at it. I'm just telling you this to say, look, if you can look for little things like that, to bring joy into people's lives, even if it costs you something, it's laying up treasures in heaven. I think that's the kind of thing that Jesus has in mind. Now, right in the middle of this discussion, Jesus drops in words about our eyesight. And years and years ago, when I read that for the first time, I thought, well, that got put in a bad place. But I don't think I understood why it's there. It's in verse 22. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. And if then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? Jesus, I'm convinced, is using a metaphor here, a metaphor of vision, to illustrate the importance of our focus. What our eyes, what our mind, what our lives are focusing on. When money is enthroned in our lives, it blinds us to the reality of Christ's reign. When money is the focus of our lives, it blinds us. And that's why Jesus says, if the eye is bad, darkness reigns. But if the eye is good, if your focus is on there instead of here, then your body is going to be full of light, and that is a very good thing. The Bible talks about the badness of the lust of the eyes. Passage in your notes. The lust of the eyes, usually people think of that as, something sexual. No. The lust of the eye is simply the eye seeing stuff that it wants. And Jesus says that has a tremendous drawing power in our hearts, and we have to be careful that it doesn't run rampant. We focus on what we treasure, and then we move toward the thing that we focus on. And when God says if our eyes are focused on Christ, they're good. If they're focused on money, then they're bad. And every single individual, there are no individuals who are exempt from this. I certainly am not. You'll like this. I heard of a preacher who came home from the office one day, and he was all excited. He told his wife that afternoon he'd had a call from a church in another city. And they offered him a job that paid him about twice as much as he was now making, 4 weeks of vacation, and membership at the local country club. And she said, what are you going to do? He said, well, I'm going upstairs right now, and I'm going to pray, and I'm going to seek the Lord's guidance. And she said, don't you think I should go up and pray with you? No, you stay here and start packing. You see, he said all the right things. But the truth of the matter was, he was enamored with the stuff. And that's a preacher. And I guarantee you, that's a valid story for preachers. Anybody can be susceptible. I think one time, I moved, probably for financial reasons. I'm not bragging, I'm confessing. We were in a situation where we were barely having ends to meet. And I got a call from another church. They were going to come down and visit with us, blah, blah, blah. And this was in just a minute, because the year is important so you know the context. It would have been 1977, that's it. And I said to my wife, we are not moving for less than $24,000 a year, and they will not offer me that much. She said, you're right, we're fine. They offered us $25,000. And I thought, well, is that a sign? You know, I don't know why I had selected that arbitrary figure, but I did. And when I thought about life, how difficult it was financially, we decided that we would go. There were other factors involved. I don't want to go into it. I had gone to a church that had split, and there were problems, and we were wearing ourselves out with the problems, and we decided to move. Now, interestingly enough, when we told the church about our decision, they said, oh, we can raise your salary. And I thought, where have you been? Where have you been? We've struggled and you had money that you... Well, anyway. But I'm just telling you that can happen to anybody. Now, there's a very insightful story that's recorded in Luke 12. By the way, Luke's gospel talks more about money than the others. Not sure why, but Dr. Luke talks more about money and gives more stories of Jesus about money. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus is teaching a class on Wednesday night to a group of seniors. And one of the people in the crowd yelled, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. And Jesus said, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. That was his response. Watch out and be on your guard against all kinds of greed. It is the only thing I know of in the New Testament where Jesus says you need to be on guard against. He doesn't say, now, be on guard against murder, because, you know, you kind of know when you're murdering. You kind of know when you're committing adultery, and there's a lot of things. But greed, a lot of times that happens and we're not aware of it. In 30 years of ministry, approximately, I have had all kinds of sins confessed to me. Some of them I didn't even know existed. But no one's ever said, my problem is greed. No one's ever said that. Maybe nobody had that problem. I don't know. But I'm just telling you that we become aware of many sins that we are committing, but we don't seem to understand that sometimes we practice greedy things. So Jesus says, spurred by that guy who yelled that he needed help getting his brother to split, you know, watch out. And if Jesus tells him to watch out for greed, I think that he would say the same thing to us. Watch out for greed. And then he takes that opportunity to tell a parable. It's the parable of the rich farmer. Y'all know that parable, don't you? This guy had a nice farm, and one year the rain was right, the sunshine was right, and the crop was unlike anything he had ever had before or ever expected to have. There was no way that he could possibly put all of this stuff into his barns. And right at that moment, he has a choice. What am I going to do with all the excess crop? I know. I'll tear down these barns, and I'll build bigger ones, and I'll fill them up to the top, and then I can take it easy and not worry about anything for the rest of my life. That's what I'm going to do. Jesus said, what a fool. He did. He said, don't you know that tonight your life will be required of you? And then asks a haunting question. And when that happens, then who'll get all this stuff? It's a parable, but it's a truth in a parable. We don't know when our lives will be ending. And I mean, we tend to think, well, I'll just live to a ripe old age. No. I take people to the airport. Most of you know that. And it's not unusual for a lady by herself. She'll say, I lost my husband 6 years ago. And I'll say, well, was he sick a long time? Or was it... No, it was quite sudden, unexpected. And I think, yeah. A lot of times death doesn't come the way we expect it to. And this man, who was in the process of planning his bigger barns, had no idea that he would never have the ability to enjoy all the bounty that his crops awarded him. Is it okay to have big crops? Of course it is. Is it okay to put it in barns? Of course it is. It is not okay to be so selfish that we never think of the possibilities of what we can do for others with the stuff that God has blessed us with. That's what's bad. You know that, right? So, that's the parable that he tells. And then he says, this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself and is not rich toward God. It's not like Jesus talks this way one time. He talks about it a number of times. This is how it will be, he says, for those who think of themselves and are not rich toward God. Then he closes the section with these words. No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Now see, if we didn't know the context of this last section, we might think that it's going to be different at the end. You cannot serve both God and Satan, or you cannot serve both God and the world, or you cannot serve both God and yourself. But no, specifically, he says you cannot serve both God and money. Now, what I would like to him to say is, well, it's just a real struggle trying to do that. It's very difficult trying to do that. Jesus has the nerve to say, it ain't possible. His English was bad that time. It can't be done. You can't serve both God and money. Now, I want you to notice something. And I could be wrong about this. But when I've thought through the scriptures that I've studied over the years, here's the conclusion I've come to. Jesus doesn't address money as a neutral commodity that needs to be stewarded. We usually say, well, money is not bad or good. It just depends on how you use it. And I understand that. But that's not how Jesus talks about money. He talks about money as a seductive power that needs to be subdued. Jesus knows that money is after his throne. You understand? Oh yeah, well, we could use it for bad, we could use it for good. Jesus says, watch out. Money is trying to take over the control of your life that I should have. That's what the king knows. Some of the last words that Paul ever penned are recorded in 1 Timothy. I know that you look up these verses, but I'm going to read a couple of them anyway. He first warns against Christians who see godliness as a means to financial gain. Can you believe that people would think that being godly would lead to financial gain, except for the sermon that I heard? No, anyway. He rebukes that idea, and then he says this, but godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. If we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Really? Would you buy that? If we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. That's just an apostle. What does he know? Those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. And this is how he concludes the instructions to Timothy, the young preacher who received this letter. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth. Sermon on the Mount. Not to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they may take hold of the life that is truly life. Wow, that's some of the last words that Paul ever penned. And I think he is hearkening back to this main point of this section of the Sermon on the Mount. Tell them not to lay up treasure for themselves, but find a way to make it a firm foundation for the coming age, the heavenly age, the one that we're all looking forward to. What is our understanding of this life and what it all means? You know, every once in a while, if I get a chance to have a less than shallow conversation with someone, I'll ask them, what do you see as the goal of this life? Or do you have any beliefs in an afterlife? And so often people will say, you know what? I haven't really thought about it. Yeah, I haven't really thought about it. Jesus says in this section, you need to think about it. And not only do you need to think about it, you need to do something about it. You remember when we studied the Beatitudes and we said, really? That's blessed? Is that really blessed? And I put on the board here this wonderful line. It was a wonderful illustration. You noticed it right off. It was the time of eternity. You noticed that. And I put a little section here, which was our life. And the rest of this was the eternity that God has planned. And I just said, for any of these to make sense, you have to be people who see the long view of things. And that is so true about this stuff. If we don't take the long view of things, and I don't mean for the rest of our lives, I'm talking about for eternity, then laying up treasures for that time makes no sense. But if we see that the time that we're going to spend with the Father is so much incredibly longer than this little span that we spend here, it makes sense to prepare for it and to lay up treasures for it. I'm going to bring up a parable. This is near the end of my lesson. But I'm going to bring up a parable that I can tell you, the first time I read it, I said, somebody made a mistake putting that in the Bible. Should that get your attention? I hope so. It's in Luke chapter 16, and the NIV entitles it, The Parable of the Shrewd Manager. Anybody familiar? I won't make you quote it. The parable of the shrewd manager. And it goes something like this. This is very close. There's this rich guy, and he's got a manager who handles everything for him. But that manager takes advantage of his place, and he's spending money and wasting the owner's money, and the owner finds out about it. And he said, I've got to get rid of that guy. But before he can fire him, the manager finds out that he's going to be fired. Remember this story? Some of you are looking like, are you sure you're in the Bible? Absolutely. You can read it, Luke 16. He says, and this is my favorite, well, I'm too old to dig, and I'm too proud to beg. What am I going to do? Oh, I got it. And he begins to call people and text them. And he says, now, how much is it that you owe? Well, I owe 100,000. I'll tell you what, let's make it 80. Really? Yeah, we'll make it 80. We'll call it good. I've got this. It's 80. And the reason why he's doing that, the text says the reason why he's doing that is because when he gets fired, he won't have any place to go, and he's counting on the fact that the people that he helped will take him in. It's in the book. And the crusher verse is verse 8, where it says, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. Wow! Didn't see that coming. Now, let me say a few words about parables right now. Sometimes people who preach about parables want to give meaning to nearly every detail in the parable. Have you ever noticed that? The parable of the Good Samaritan, well, he poured oil in. Well, that stands for the Holy Spirit and the wine. Look, don't do that to parables. Essentially, parables are told to make one major point. In the story of the Good Samaritan is, everybody's your neighbor. Okay? In this story, it should be obvious. The point is not, hey, I should act dishonestly so I get commended. Here's the main point. Don't miss this. When you know there's a reckoning coming, get ready for it. This guy knows I'm going to get fired and I'm going to be in a pickle, so I have got to do something. Jesus is saying in that parable, look, I've been telling you all along, there's a day of reckoning coming. You need to do something to prepare for it. And in this case, it's not to call people to reduce their wages or their debts, rather. It is to make sure that you've got treasures laid up in heaven. That is the main point of the parable in Luke 16, and the only one, I believe, that makes sense. As I said in the beginning, our granddaughter's obsession with our mortality has made us more aware of our mortality. I don't know how many years that we have. But I do know that in my own life, I've probably been too preoccupied with stuff. And I don't say this with any kind of preacher mentality. This lesson and preparing for this lesson has been hard on me. Because I don't want to be that guy. But in so many ways, I find that I am that guy. And I will confess something to you. I hope you find this as funny as it was. You know that after the election, the stock market went crazy. You know that, right? The stock market went crazy. So on Monday morning, that was all last week. So on Monday morning, I'm working on this lesson, tirelessly working on the importance of laying up treasures in heaven. And I think, oh, I wonder what the stock market's doing today. And I looked at my phone to find out. And I started laughing. Because I was immediately attracted to the prospect of how my stuff was doing when I'm trying. Now, that kind of thing probably never happens to you. But I know that it does. I know that, no, I don't know. I assume We all, to some degree or another, struggle with this. And I guess I would just say that whatever it means to you to lay up treasures in heaven, don't wait. The man who wanted to build bigger barns thought that was the better approach. Jesus said, "You fool." We don't want to be fools. We want to realize that we're not promised anything in this life and that we should be content. If we have food and clothing, Paul says, we will be content with that. One final thing. In Hebrews chapter 11, many of you know that this is the great faith chapter in the Bible, where the author, who we don't know who it was, the author talks about the great faith heroes of the Old Testament, people like Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Joseph and Moses and David, all of those people who follow the leading of God and put their trust in God. And by the way, we need to be able to add our names onto that list. You should be able to hear your name called in there. The author concludes this. All these people, all the heroes, were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. They were looking for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Now, I'm here to tell you, it's my job, that the God you love and serve has prepared a city. It is some kind of place. And there is a place for you there, and I think that assumes that because you have put your hope there, you will put your treasures there as well. I think that's what Jesus is telling us to do. And so many times he warns us in one way or another. If you are short-sighted enough to think only about yourself in terms of your stuff, you are missing the boat badly. Think about, what can I do to lay up treasures in heaven? Because I know that moths and rust and vermin or whatever can't touch that stuff. That will be waiting for me when I get there. The question is, will we trust that promise? Will we take the long view of things to say eternity is right around the corner and I want to make sure that I have amply prepared for what that will bring? Will we trust enough to lay up treasures in heaven? Now, if that sounded like preaching, it probably was. But again, I tell you, this lesson was hard on me. All right.